Hi, Mikaela. How are you?
Good. How are you,
Oh,
Catherine?
I am so excited to have a snippet of time with you because you and I are so busy. We hardly ever get to spend any time together. And you are my favourite geek chic, it has to be said. Really excited to chat with you today because what you've achieved over the last 10 years just blows my mind in terms of the perceptions of how you apply technology and the perceptions of how technology can grow, especially with the lens of First Nations people on it. So thank you so much for blowing my mind on a
Oh,
regular basis.
thanks for having me.
One of the things that I really love about your career path is you started where my heart is, which is in Mother Nature as a park ranger. Can you tell us a bit about how you landed that job and then how it got you to this job?
Yeah, so I started as a park ranger because I thought I was just really good at being in the bush. I spent a lot of time in the bush growing up, and I didn't actually know that it was my country that I was growing up with and on. So I just had these connections that I couldn't explain, and I thought, well, I'll just do an environmental biology degree because I'm just really good at understanding nature. And it turns out it's because I'm from nature and I'm a custodian of nature as a first person. So that's how I became a ranger. And I saw augmented reality for the first time in 2012, and that's how I got interested in technology.
What was it that triggered that relationship between understanding the system you were working in and then recognizing a need?
I actually saw a technology that inspired me to work in it, which was augmented and mixed reality. And immediately saw an opportunity to use that technology to share stories, specifically Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander stories, knowledge, language, and law.
So, what does this sort of augmented reality or mixed reality actually look like, physically look like to you when you're out on country or when you're talking to people back in boardrooms or classrooms?
So imagine that you were at a cultural place in a national park and you could put your mobile phone up to that cultural place and our traditional owners appear as a hologram and tell you the importance of the story of the place where you're standing.
Would you say it's true that in Australia we don't really maybe recognise fully the cultural significance of a lot of our natural formations, a lot of Mother Nature, of what we see and the stories behind it?
Yeah, and that's really frustrating as a first person. So, we are the oldest scientists in the world. We have 80,000 years of scientific knowledge about ecosystems, about country, about relationships of people to this place, and about how to adapt to climate change. So, it is really frustrating as a first person to turn up to a national park and read a sign about how old our place is, disregarding the rest of the knowledge that's at the site. So I saw augmented reality as a way to bridge that gap between what the visitor currently experiences through a metal sign and what we could actually empower them with when they come to our special places.
So it's an interesting concept to me. So you could be stood somewhere where there's a rock outcrop or somewhere that you've hiked through as a kid, for example. How do you take that idea from very first concepts and actually then turn it into that technical output?
Yeah, so it took 9 years to develop the technology, and we were really pioneering using augmented reality outside in places without the internet. And that was incredibly important to me because a lot of our places are remote and regional. So I wanted to build a technology that enabled our people to tell our stories, so the right story at the right time, at the right place for the right reasons.
So did you have a particular place that you had a personal connection to and maybe your family and you wanted to tell that particular story? Tell us about that.
Yeah, so I'm a Cabrogal woman from the Darug speaking nation. So our country is the Georges River in Liverpool area of Sydney. And I actually grew up on my country, but I didn't know that I was from the Cabrogal people. So it wasn't until I was later in my life where I wanted to be able to connect with my mob, and it was incredibly difficult to do that as a second generation person that had been separated from culture. So I did grow up with all the petroglyphic rock art around me, and I always used to go to cultural places when I was a kid and run my finger through the petroglyphs, wondering what the story was that we were supposed to learn there. And when I was 29, I got reconnected with my people and thought, what an amazing way for us to be able to share knowledge about cultural places like the ones I grew up on, which were my own country.
So are these stories that still exist in terms of modern storytelling, or are they stories that were lost that you've had to re-find using some of these technologies?
A lot of the stories still exist. So we had people in our communities that held on to language, that held on to knowledge and held on to law, even though they were being persecuted for decades for being Aboriginal people in Sydney. So I'm very grateful to our elders for being so strong in holding those stories. The real magic actually happens not with the technology. It happens where we find an excuse to come together as young people and old people and share in those stories in order to create something new in the technology.
I think this is something that we can all reflect on, that the technology isn't necessarily the answer, but it's the pathway to the conversations that can create the answer. Is that something that you've directly experienced from moving from a park ranger to being a person running a tech startup?
Yeah, definitely. And something that really inspired me to work this way was a moment in Kakadu on country with some of the elders. And one elder in particular told me a story about how it takes 3 days for their young people to engage in culture now because they're always in their phone. So she said the first day they're on their phone and they're ignoring us. The second day the battery goes flat and they're really cranky and having withdrawals for their technology. And then the third day they give in to listening to elders, and that's when the story can take place. So I immediately thought about, what if we put our cultures in the technology where the young people are, but also brought elders along for that journey so they can give us the authority to be able to share in language, law and knowledge.
So, I mean, I've just got quite emotional even thinking about this concept that we have to take things to our youth, but we have to provide a bridge between our elders and our youth, and that technology could be that bridge. Could you tell us a bit more about how you felt watching that process unfold?
I actually cried a lot when I first saw the augmented reality working, because it took us 18 months to develop the image recognition technologies to work outside in massive cultural places. So we weren't just doing photogrammetry with small sites, we were doing them on an epic scale. Yeah, it was very emotional seeing an elder who we'd been working with appear in holographic format for the first time. And my own reaction just proved to me how moving it can be to have these experiences through AR.
So, with the law and the language and the songs and the culture, if you hadn't got this technology, if you hadn't got the drones, if you hadn't got the augmented reality, would this be dying in the mouths of the elders that are carrying it at the moment?
I don't think so. I don't think that this is a silver bullet for protecting our language, knowledge, and law, but it certainly provides that space to come together to do that sharing in a way that's really exciting for young people. So we're kind of getting them away from playing games on the phone to like, hey, why don't we design the games and we're going to show you a process and a technology that works.
So, when you saw that first sort of project where you talked with the elders, recognized that you were going to use technology as a pathway to engage the youth, how did you feel when you saw this, this connection happening? What frustrated you? How did you feel?
It was really interesting because there were men that wanted to be a part of the program that came across from the Arnhem Land side and heard about the project and said, we'd like to work in it. And there were the other community members that were unsure of the technology. But once they saw it, everyone came together and said, we want to tell more stories like this. How do we do it?
So, this technology has taken you all the way to the United Nations in New York, which must be a huge highlight for your career. But what other highlights did you have leading up to that?
Yeah, so once we developed the minimum viable product, we could show people what augmented reality was. I was invited to the UN in New York to talk to other First Peoples around the world about this kind of technology. And we were also really trying to find our way through, what do the intellectual property and moral rights obligations look like for practitioners in this area, and having an international discussion about that, because there's currently no policies or even laws that protect our cultural knowledge systems in these places.
So, when we look at it from, say, an ethical standpoint, there's a big rush at the moment for open data. So, people are going to be collecting imagery from culturally significant sites. How do we start having those conversations about cultural identity? And do you think technology has an answer to protecting some of that?
I think there are some technologies that can help us with that, but first and foremost, I think it's working with our communities. So there's 400 million First Peoples around the world that are newly interfacing with these technologies, but they have thousands of years of cultural protocols behind them and in the way they present their cultures in any kind of format, whether it's digital or not. And we need opportunities and spaces for our elders to set what the new cultural laws are in things like the spatial web, as well as working with drones and working with data. So, yeah, I think having those conversations and having people in community that know enough about technology to ask the right questions of our old people, who can then help us work through what the new cultural protocols should be.
So, when you're dealing with these elders, are they typically women or men? And what are you finding as a woman in tech in terms of opportunities, but also where are you slipping through the cracks of the traditionally funded tech startup system?
At the moment, I'm working with the Darug aunties to work through what these cultural protocols look like for Darug. But it's been a combination of men and women. We've done a lot of work with Indigenous women in tech and upskilling women, but we're conscious that we need to also make sure that men feel involved in that, because we have cultural responsibilities for both genders.
So you and I first connected over our mutual love for drones, a bit of drone geek chic, wasn't
Yes,
it?
it was.
All those years ago. And you know that I really love the drones, but, unleash the flying monkeys. It's what you can do with the platform technologies. So was there a time that you recognised that you were just as much in love with the technology as you were with what you could do with the technology?
Yes, there was. There was 2 times actually. So first was in 2012 when I first saw augmented reality and I imagined the potential, but the way that I was imagining the potential of the technology was how we could actually develop it in 2020. So I had to wait a really long time for the tech to catch up with what I saw in my mind's eye. And that was having our elders in holographic format and programming them with natural language processing. So what that really means is we can create holograms, but we can encode it with algorithms that can hear what you're asking the holograms, and the hologram can respond to you. And we did that last year with my elders, Auntie Julie and Auntie Karina. We made them into holographic format. We then embedded their holograms with natural language processing algorithms. And so users can ask them a question and they respond in Darug and in English.
So in terms of law and in terms of how First Peoples in Australia process death, how do you match up the cultural sensitivities around data that's then going to be permanently available of people who may have passed on?
The way that we acknowledge that is to first acknowledge that there's over 300 nations of people in Australia. We all have different cultures. We all have different languages. We all have different ways that we honour death and death protocols. So it really means working with First Peoples on an individual basis to determine what they want done with their data and their expressions when they pass over. A lot of people we work with now understand that our images and our videos are captured ubiquitously throughout our lives and are a lot less sensitive to having their image and their voices represented after they pass away. And I was really surprised by this when we built the first holograms in Kakadu, because the aunties said, "Don't take me down. I want to stay there, because if I am there, even in this form, I know the truth is being told about this place." So there was a real shift in cultural protocol for these women, which surprised me.
It's interesting, isn't it, that people, you don't know how they're going to be around technology till you get them around technology. So what's been some of your biggest aha moments or biggest surprises that you've had when you've been developing this work?
I love this moment. I was working with a drone in Kakadu, and one of the traditional owners who had never seen a drone before turned around and asked me if she could fly in it. And then I was like, "You just invented Uber Air."
Yeah.
So I love the way that our people see a technology and they imagine the future of that technology before perhaps anyone else is imagining what they can do with it. So I love that we bring our 80,000 years of knowing how systems work into seeing these new technologies.
Indigenous engineering or First Nations engineering and science, what have you taken from that in terms of system-led thinking when developing your tech startup and your approach?
I think the first thing to think of is that time's not linear for us. So it's circular, and it's the past, present, and the future all together in once. And even thinking about holograms, our people have seen holographic images of ourselves in their mind's eye for 80,000 plus years. So this is not actually new. They've been waiting that long for the tech to catch up to be able to do it. Looking at technologies through our lens and not having this linear way of thinking, and we really think in a systems way. We've been embedded in an ecological system since time began. So we have a very deep understanding about how nature works, how rivers flow, how the universe works. And it's really nice that we're being asked now to contribute to the development of new technologies through this lens that we've always had.
So what other First Nations countries have really got involved with your work? Who else are you partnering with globally?
We're really excited to be working with the Saikaz Nation in Canada. They've been our first international pilot community. We've learnt so much, and the cultural sharing that's happened through doing our Indigital Schools program together has been so impactful for both nations of people. And we're working with the community in Rotorua, the Māori community. We're really excited to see where we can take this. As I mentioned, there's 400 million First Peoples around the world. So this is not just a challenge facing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, it's global. And we have nations all around the world that want to intersect with new technologies but need to find that pathway for them to be able to achieve it in their own way.
As a woman leading this really new and emerging exponential technology and how it's being applied, are you finding that being a woman has actually made it harder for you to get investment and traction and people taking you seriously, or do you think it's made it easier for you?
Definitely harder. So you'll know that I think we get 2% of venture capital globally for our businesses. When you apply the Indigenous lens to that too, we don't even rank in the 0%. So we don't have a statistic around female Indigenous technology entrepreneurs, which is devastating, obviously, for me. I've been told in the past that because I'm female, Aboriginal, working in cutting edge tech in remote communities, that it's just deemed incredibly high risk for investment. So it has been very difficult for us to get support. It's just lucky that I'm persistent, that we're still here, because it would have been incredibly easy to give up.
Nevertheless, she persisted, right? So, I mean, you must sit here now and look back over the last 10 years or so. How do you feel sitting where you are right now, recognised global award winner, being recognised for all of your work?
I feel quite exhausted, actually. Yeah, I feel excited, and having a team around me now is just next level. I couldn't have expected to have so many phenomenal Aboriginal people working with me in my company. So I feel kind of vindicated, I guess, in a way, but there's so much more work to do, and I know that we're really just at the beginning. And a beautiful mentor of mine who recently passed over said something very special to me, and she said, you have to recognize this is your life's work and it will not be finished in your lifetime, and you have to be okay with that. I feel a sense of responsibility and commitment to what we're doing, but I know that it's something that other people are going to have to carry on after I pass over.
So where do you get that passion? Where do you get that energy from to actually work and create something that you know is not going to finish when you finish? Like, where's it all come from?
I have 10,000 ancestors behind me, so that's something that we like to remind ourselves. You know, my ancestors didn't go through all the trauma they've been through for me to just give up. So I feel a deep sense of responsibility, not just to my ancestors, but also to the 7 generations in front of me. And I'm cognizant in our work that everything that we do today needs to be accessible and viewable to our 7th generation descendant in 2170.
So where do you go to when you need to sort of recenter yourself? Where's the energy that you go to? Where's the passion that you find? What drives you to keep changing things?
Just recognising that I come from a long line of strong Indigenous women who would have wanted me to try my hardest, and they really struggled when we were colonised in Australia. So I descend from one of the first 5 stolen generation from Governor Macquarie in the 1800s, and ancestors and descendants from that woman petitioned the government for Indigenous land rights back in 1840. Then her sons, Lucy Lean's sons, went off to fight in wars that they were never paid for. So, for example, when my ancestors fought in the First and Second World Wars, we didn't get paid for that work. And in fact, our land got taken away from us. So my place in Sydney is the Holsworthy military base, and we can't even set foot on that country anymore because of unexploded ordnance and the fact that it's a military parcel of land. So we're countryless in some ways. I've been tongueless growing up. I'm learning my tongue right now, and I'm trying to teach my daughters at the same time that I'm learning. So I know intimately as an Aboriginal person what it's like to lose your land and to lose your language and to lose your law. So I try very hard to make sure when I'm working with other First Peoples that they get an insight of what that looks like for them in the future through our experience as Cabral people.
So what you've done so far blows my mind in that as a woman in tech, you're up against barriers. As a woman of colour in tech, you're up against barriers. So taking what you've achieved so far now, what do you see for your daughters and for their children 7 generations into the future? Where do you see the work that you've done now taking them?
Yeah, I see potential. So my daughters want to work in the company, and they're actually the reason that the company still exists, because the 3 times I've wanted to quit, my daughters have said, no, Mum, you can't quit because we want to work in the company. So they're already seeing a future for themselves in cutting edge technologies, and we're creating pathways and really huge networks around the world to make sure that we can work in industries like the civil space sector. So for space, you would know that that sounds really interesting to have First Peoples wanting to be involved in space. But can you imagine, we've got so many satellites flying over us right now, but they're only looking at the world through a Western lens. none of that data they're collecting is being looked through an Indigenous lens, through a lens that is the oldest scientific knowledge in the world. And we're missing out on so much information about managing country, agriculture, climate change. There's so many aspects where our people could be helping to understand or increase our knowledge about the world.